Welcome to the Wounded Angels Network as we are following the discussion on the theme of the radical Christ. Remembering the analogy I used of the rosary and linking where every decade is a particular scene from the Gospels, and so while you pray the 10 Hail Marys, you meditate on one of those themes. And linking that with Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey and the stages of every hero, a legend or myth, remembering that a myth is a true story that probably never happened. We are in the first stage of Jesus' life. In other words, the meditations are around the preparation. So in my map of understanding Jesus as this archetype for every human life, I see Jesus' life as preparation. That's the phase we're in now. Then there is the active ministry. Then there is the abject failure, that is a basic requirement for every human life. And then there is the integration and the resurrection. So we're still in that first phase. And today I want to finish off the preparation phase by having a look at three of the childhood events that are kind of often just glossed over because they're not really significant. The middle one, perhaps a little more so. So there are these really dark background stories that link in with the story of the birth of Jesus. It's not all just wonderful, beautiful little shepherds singing and choirs of angels and visits of the Magi bringing gifts and the Virgin and the stable. There's also a very dark part of the story, and I want to pick it up in Matthew's second chapter, the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel. What has happened is the wise men, or the Magi, had come from the east, had gone to see Herod asking about the king. He then said, please come back and tell me when you find him. They go off, follow the star, get to Bethlehem, worship, and then are warned not to go back to Herod. And we pick up the story there. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learnt from the wise men. A dreadful story. So this jealous king hears that another king has been born, and then when he can't find out exactly who this king is, he then just arranges for all children in and around the region of Bethlehem to be slaughtered. And the archetypal question for me is, I wonder how that must have weighed on the mind of Jesus, to know that your birth created such death, that your coming into being took so many other people out of being. What is it like to work with the energy of saying, I survived at the cost of others, or I survived whilst others didn't? And one comes across this in a whole lot of different contexts. I remember recently in a public workshop, one of my colleagues telling of how when they were born, their mother had been married before, and when she was born, the person telling the story, she would have had elder siblings. I think half brothers they would have been, half brothers and sisters. When she was born, her mother died in childbirth. And the older half brothers and sisters forever used to say, you killed our mother. And you can imagine how that had affected this person who was telling the story. I know of another story of somebody who was in the womb as a twin. And then during the pregnancy, as often happens, one of the fetuses isn't viable. And so the the twin dies, and it's just, by the time this person is born, there's just the small remains of what was another but not viable life that ended. One has the situation of people who walk away from near-death experiences where others have actually been killed. People who walk away from a car wreck. You have the situation of what I've come to call angel moms, where a child dies, often tragically, accidentally, in an accident, tragically. The child dies and the parent remains, and there's forever this question is, why the child? The child was so full of potential. Couldn't it not have been me? And so there is a whole thing called survivor guilt. And I'm not going to start even trying to pretend that I can understand how these things work. It's just, I think, arrogant. And I think it's really not helpful when people have all sorts of theories about such huge tragedies. But simply to say that Jesus himself would have understood this dynamic of being a survivor where others had died in the slaughter of the innocents. I think what we can say is that moments like this, these tragedies, near-death experiences, walking away when other people have died, your life is spared and others die, makes us deeply aware that human life is very precious and human life is very, very fragile. And so we'll never know how this event, or the slaughter of the innocents, shaped Jesus' life, but I'm sure we can work with it as an archetype that helps us as we deal with our own losses and our own tragedies, to know that here in this divine person of Jesus, we have this reality showing up, this dark shadow in the life of this young Christ boy, Jesus. So that's the slaughter of the innocents, one of the childhood events. The other one is the one that is more famous, probably, and better known to us, and it comes from the second chapter of Luke's Gospel. So we were in Matthew, now we're in Luke, and it's a story about the finding of Jesus in the temple. And we read, "Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends, and when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, 'Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety.' And he said to them, 'Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?' But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them." And we'll pick that last bit up in a moment. But this story of the 12-year-old Jesus being found in the temple has often been commented on as, oh yes, that is Jesus's Bar Mitzvah. He would have been there, it would have been his Bar Mitzvah, he was 12 years old, the age when Jewish boys have their Bar Mitzvah. Well, it's not as simple as that. It's always tricky to date the Gospels. There's all sorts of theories about when the Gospels were written. But one thing we can say very clearly is that at the time of Jesus, the beginning of CE, the Common Era, there was no such thing as a Bar Mitzvah. And I find it fascinating when I was preparing for this to go into the history and discover that there was no sort of rite of passage for young boys or girls in the culture of the time. Little people were regarded just as little adults. There was no kind of initiation or rite of passage. What there was at the age of 20, a father would say a prayer in the synagogue, and the prayer would go something like, "Thank you, God, that from this day onwards, I don't have to care for my son's finances anymore." It's a good prayer that I think a lot of parents would like to pray. So that's all there was. There's this prayer in the synagogue: "Thank you, my child is an adult, 20 years old, I'm no longer responsible for him." And all you businessmen here, you hear that. That's his problem. It's only later, in what is called the Talmudic period, that the age shifts and becomes 12 for this prayer. Nothing more, just this prayer of adulthood. So the age shifts younger down to 12. Now the Talmudic period begins with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So in about AD 70, after quite a long period of rebellion which goes through the life of Christ against the Romans, eventually the Romans have just had enough and they go in and they destroy Jerusalem. And the temple itself is destroyed in 70 AD. It's only in the Talmudic period that the age becomes younger to 12. So there's a disconnect here. Or let's say that the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, he could have been in the temple, but the fact that he was 12 would have not had any significance, and certainly no link to a Bar Mitzvah, because the interesting thing about Bar Mitzvahs is they only appear on the scene in the 12th century, and they appear in the Jewish communities in France, where they begin being celebrated kind of like adult rites of passage, linked with a birthday, linked with a confirmation, all that kind of stuff. And from there just erupts where today there are huge Hollywood productions where parents spend thousands on these bar mitzvahs, and it just becomes another consumer event, just like children's birthday parties have become massive consumer events. The point is, in the time of Jesus, there was none of that going on. So what is this thing about him being in his Father's house? That doesn't make sense either, because if we look at the life of Jesus as an adult in his ministry, which we will come to in the next phases, Jesus is seldom in his Father's house. He teaches in synagogues, but synagogues are not the temple. To be in his Father's house meant to be in the temple. And here's the thing, to be in the temple meant that you had to go through a whole period of ritual cleansing to go and serve in the temple. It was part of Jewish law. Jesus in his adult life hung out with shepherds, with fishermen, with tax collectors, with women, with prostitutes, with drunkards. The list goes on and on of the undesirables that Jesus hung around with. And scholars have pointed out, people like Dominic Crossan have pointed out, that Jesus hung out with all these untouchables, that he would have been ritually unclean for the entire duration of his public ministry. So this thing of in the Father's house, again, doesn't make sense. And I have no explanation for it. All I can say is that we should be careful of reading back into the story that, oh, that was his bar mitzvah, and yes, he was in the temple teaching. I wonder if this story hasn't been written backwards to try and bring some kind of point across about Jesus being in the religious establishment of his Father's house. Nothing could be further from the truth. Jesus took his Father's house outside, or he took his Father out of the Holy of Holies in the temple, and he made God public, which is what this whole series is about, the arrival of God back, incarnation into ordinary life. There's this beautiful scene we've just witnessed on Easter Sunday when Andrea Bocelli in Milano, at the Duomo in Milano, at the end of that lovely concert where it was just him because of lockdown and the organist and obviously the cameraman, performing these beautiful classical prayers, as he said, not a performance, praying these beautiful, beautiful classical prayers. You'll remember how it ends. You have Andrea Bocelli, the blind tenor, walking out of the cathedral onto the square and singing, of all things, Amazing Grace. I don't want to get too hung up with the child Jesus, 12 years old, in the temple. The Jesus that I have come to understand is the one who walks out of the temple and takes that very special presence of God out there and takes it even to the most unclean people on the outside. I think that, for me, is a profound image. So, to the third point, we've spoken about the slaughter of the innocents, how we work with the fact that we're still alive when many others aren't. Why are we still here? You know, and for me to live, was it at the cost of others? How do you work with that? Be careful of reading back things into Jesus and trying to make him fit cultural things that have evolved since his time. Certainly, when the Gospel of Luke was written, there was no temple. And the temple was gone, but Jesus had walked out of the temple by then. And then the last thing I want to talk about is this. Well, it's linked to the whole question of this 12-year-old encounter, or the encounter with the 12-year-old Jesus, and then everything goes silent. We don't hear anything in the gospel narratives about Jesus from the age of 12 until he begins his public ministry and he arrives to be baptized by John the Baptizer in the Jordan. And he is then said to be 30 years old. So there are 18 missing years. His 12-year-old encounter in the temple, the story that we just referred to, when his parents berate him, and he says, "Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. And then we read, "Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth," which was their hometown, "and was obedient to them." He was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. And then the 18 years of silence. Now, of course, when there's silence, there's always going to be room for conjecture. And today I'm inviting you to choose between an exotic interpretation of what could have happened or a very ordinary interpretation of what I particularly think happened during those 18 years. The exotic one you probably have heard in various forms, and that is that there was the existence of the Silk Route. This young Jesus, as he grew up, could have very easily in those 18 years have gone on the Silk Route, because the Greeks, Alexander the Great had established the Silk Route. Jesus could have gone to India. And there's all sorts of stories about how Jesus went to India and he became an enlightened guru. And there's a strong theme, if you can see the picture on the back here. This actually comes from Chennai in India. It's a very popular icon of Jesus sitting in a meditative pose, as a Hindu or a Buddhist sannyasin would. That's the exotic one. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I actually quite like the ordinary one. The ordinary one is hinted at here, where Jesus goes and was obedient to them. He went down with them, came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them. And it's very interesting that the Greek word here that is used for obedient is actually a military word. It means he became submissive to them as one would to a military structure. He became an obedient soldier in that way. I don't need, you see, Jesus to be this exotic Indian guru traveler to go and find the secret wisdom. I think the 18 years spent living very simply in Nazareth, watching his father Joseph, the carpenter, spending time with his mother, just being part of a regular, ordinary, poor, peasant Jewish family. That could have been a wonderful education. And if COVID-19 lockdown has taught us anything, it's taught us to reconnect with the simple, everyday, menial tasks of living. Things that we often have outsourced to domestic workers or to other people to do for us. Suddenly now we can't just send out for food, we have to cook it ourselves. We have to clean our own homes, we have to do our own laundry. There's something very powerful in the ordinary. Now, in previous years in my active pastoral ministry, I was involved in the training of student ministers at a seminary. And I used to drive them crazy because when they were preparing for ordination, I would point out mischievously to these young men and women who have studied for 6 years and are so geared up for this ordination where they are going to become fully ordained ministers of the gospel. I would point out to them, you do know that the word ordination and the word ordinary come from the same root, to be ordered, to take holy orders, to become ordinary. And they would get so angry because they didn't want to be ordinary. They wanted to be the reverend whoever. And they wanted to wear all these fancy clothes and the lounge curtains and dress up and have their collars turned around. I don't think ordination is meant to be a fancy dress. I don't think the priesthood is meant to be dressed in the lounge curtains, as pretty as that might be. I think the most important lessons in life are learnt from being ordinary. And I think it is in the ordinariness of the daily life of Nazareth that Jesus grew into the integrated person that he was. I don't know if you know what this is. It's an acorn. And I'm grateful to James Hillman, who the Jungian psychologist, who in the Soul's Code points out that inside this acorn is an entire oak tree. If one cares for this acorn and plants it and nurtures it in the right soil, in the right conditions, it'll grow. And it'll grow only into an oak tree. It cannot, this acorn cannot become a pine or a peach. And to plant this and expect a pineapple is really just silly. Jesus went and he submitted himself almost in a military way to being ordinary, to being ordered. And in the soil of a home life, that beautiful life began to grow and be formed. And 18 years later, began a ministry that changed the world. So, thank you for your attention. This ends the phase of Jesus' preparation as we looked at the shadow of how our precious lives are still with us, and we still have the opportunity every day to be alive where so many others haven't, like with the slaughter of the innocents. How we must be careful of keeping Jesus in the temple with his father's business, when in fact, like Andrea Bocelli, he walked out of the temple and the temple was destroyed. And finally, how we are not called to grandiosity and to be ordained. We are called to be ordinary and to flourish in the soil and the ground where we've been planted. Thank you very much for your attention.